offsetting pollutants up until recently, and now the full danger of these greenhouse gases is being exposed right now. All in all, it's not a great picture. We lost a lot of time, but there are real reasons, not just rhetorical reasons, but real reasons for hope in that the improvements of what can be done and the mechanisms for making those improvements and the realization that such transformations of energy need to be done at a cross-national, regional scale, whether it's ASEAN or the African Union or South America. All of this, to my mind, is very good news that we're getting closer and closer to a breakthrough. I have not heard from one president, at least directly, I speak to many heads of state, I haven't heard from one this year that the U.S. abandonment of this issue under Trump is changing their view at all, either about the science or about the determination to move forward.
That's interesting. And of course, you brought up the sticky subject of climate finance, which you've been central in discussing. And this idea of countries clubbing together, creating yes. regional systems. Is that part of the answer to tackling the finance conundrum?
It's very interesting. It is part of the answer. It's part of the answer for a couple of reasons. One, most countries cannot really have a green energy system just on their own, except at very high cost. So the United States really needs Canadian hydropower, for example. I know in New York City we need the Northern Quebec hydropower to make the transformation in New York City at an affordable rate, and that's going to happen. We need Mexico's sunshine to help bring clean electrons, green electrons into the American Southwest. And you look at smaller countries, they absolutely need to get together just to have a grid that doesn't depend on enormous storage, which is very costly, but rather makes the play that maybe it's not sunny here, but it's sunny where you are. Maybe it's not windy here, but it's sunny where you are, or it's windy there and not sunny here, and so we can share these intermittent energy sources. So interconnection just lowers the outright costs of what needs to be done. But there's a second reason as well, which is that poor countries and small economies are systematically punished in the credit ratings. It's a little weird. I have some debates with the rating agencies, but basically, even if you just look at their scorecard methodology, if you're small, you get a lower score than if you're large. I don't think that's good intrinsic economics necessarily. There's a smidgen of logic to it, but in any event, it's solvable. Get together with your neighbors, then you're big. And there are examples that I like very much. And today I had meetings with the CAF, which is the Bank for Latin America, or it used to be called the Andean Development Fund. But now it's a Latin America-wide multilateral bank. They are well-rated investment-grade credit ratings, but their owners throughout Latin America, most of them or many of them are sub-investment grade. So the bank has a rating far above the owner's ratings. And it's not the case that they're playing off of guarantees from the United States or Europe. What Moody's says, for example, says, yes, you're highly credit rated. And I ask them, yeah, but their owners are not. Yes, but they say, yes, but the bank is well run. It's well capitalized. You look at it objectively, it's an A3 or even better institution. And the fact that you have B or lower ratings among some of the owners doesn't matter. The bank is well capitalized. It's well run. It's got diversification of risk and so forth. And that says to me, they're doing something by pooling together in a regional bank that they could not really do on their own. And I think that in general, raising finance regionally, if you can show we have a regional project, maybe regional offtake, a regional integrated power grid and market, and even a bank, a multilateral development bank that is capitalized by the countries of the region, All of this can bring down the cost of capital, and that is absolutely key for making these projects work.
We've seen the development banks rising in this conversation for the last couple of years. And you have, of course, recommended reforms at the World Bank specifically, but throughout the system. What specifically do we need to see them doing in this reform in order to kind of open lending up a bit more and move more money?
The main thing is their lending is limited by their capital. And there's a debate about what kind of leverage you can get, how much can you loan on a dollar of paid-in capital or callable capital. And there's a debate that says maybe the leverage that they're taking now is less than they could. Why don't you increase the leverage from 3 times capital to 5 times capital? And then the argument is, yes, but the bank will not be AAA anymore. It may lose a notch or two. Is that worth it? And so forth. Those are all fine questions. The fact of the matter is the owners of these banks should put in more money. That's all. This is not a heavy lift. This is the world. This is saving the world climate, saving all of our economies, whether some of our politicians know it or not. But the U.S. has been tied up in knots on this. Even though the World Bank serves so many U.S. purposes, and it sits, for heaven's sake, at 18th and Pennsylvania Avenue, so it's almost a U.S. institution, even though it's, of course, truly a multilateral institution. But the U.S. has a lot of influence in it, let's face it. The U.S. drags its feet on enabling the bank to operate at the scale that it should be operating. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is Congress and the White House and our politics are so self-absorbed that they can't understand that funding this energy transformation is good for the United States as well as good for the recipient countries. So they don't get it, and they don't want to put even very modest amounts of money where they should be putting it. But the second is that no doubt more capital going into the banks would mean a larger vote for China, which is one of the owners of the World Bank. And China's underrepresented at the bank. And the way the bank representation works is that you get a voting share that is equal, essentially, to your paid-in capital, your share of the total paid-in capital, or your quota at the IMF. I say, of course, give China a larger share. They're big world economy, very important. They want to contribute. What's the worry? But in Washington, they've got some neurotic reaction to this, which I don't agree with at all, I have to say. But they don't want China to play a larger role. What's happening as a result is the World Bank is stuck. It's stuck at a level of finance that is completely inadequate to the scale of need and the potential of the bank as really a well-staffed, highly professional institution that could do so much more if it had more capital to leverage into long-term financing. So the bank is stuck, and then China says, okay, you don't want us to have our say, we'll make some new banks. And China just announced a new SCO bank, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. People will recall the leaders of, well, President Putin, President Xi were together, Prime Minister Modi, and others were in Tianjin, China recently at a meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is an Asian group of countries, and they announced a new development bank. And okay, I'm in favor of it, but one of the reasons that this is happening is things are paralyzed in Washington.
You mentioned again also COP30 is a big agenda for this year's conference. Is there one or two things that we absolutely need to see happen there? With an agenda that's looking at all past pledges, how we're going to implement those pledges, which are more important than others?
So one thing is the United States has basically walked out of the COP process. The meeting will be a lot more pleasant. Unfortunately, I'm sorry to say it, but the U.S. as a government has dragged its feet year in, year out. Trump has just walked out. now they may actually get something done without a paralysis coming from Washington. Very high on the agenda and very interesting for the Brazilian presidency is the issue of the emissions from land use and land use change. You know, most of what we think about when we think of greenhouse gas emissions is carbon dioxide. Of course, methane and nitrous oxide also are important, but we think of carbon dioxide, and then when we think of carbon dioxide, we think of fossil fuels. But really a significant part of the emissions, it's debated, maybe 20% or so, comes from land use change. And an even higher proportion of the solution could come from land use change, because there's a lot of degraded land in the world that, if it was brought back to forests, for example, would store really a lot of carbon. And so you can suck up the carbon not only geologically, as people have tried to do, but just biologically by restoring degraded lands. So Brazil is championing solutions for the forests. They want to start 1, maybe 2 specialized forest funds for the world. One to help give an incentive to not chop down the forest. Another that I'm very interested in is an incentive to help restore forests, because you get a lot of carbon for the buck if you do land restoration. So I think that that's going to be a big theme. Of course, this is also the period in which countries are to put in their nationally determined contributions. That's important. I think even more important is long-term, they call them low-emission development strategies. It was something I helped to stick in a clause into the Paris Agreement. I argued for it very much, Article 4.19, which says the country should have long-term plans, not only 5-year improved national contributions. And the reason I like the long-term plans is you can't really get a deep change just by looking ahead 5 or 10 years and then updating every 5 years and then updating. That has a point, but it's also important. Look ahead 30 years. Look ahead 35 years. What will your energy system look like? What will your primary energy sources be? How much will you be on a grid with your neighbors? Maybe even very long distance transformation. What are you going to do about hydrogen? Many issues, you need a long-term perspective. And I want governments everywhere to make at least now the plan to 2050, so that they say, by 2050, here's where we can be. And then to quantify that, and you don't need more than a spreadsheet. You need Excel. You don't need any fancy models. But on a spreadsheet for the next 25 years, what's going to happen in all of the major energy-using sectors, in transport, in buildings, in industry, in power generation, and what pace of investment change will get you to where you want to go by 2050.
That's interesting that you say that. So I first became familiar with your work about 20 years ago. I was a correspondent in India, environment correspondent, and I came across Commonwealth. And the thing that struck me in Commonwealth was how you had laid out the situation across the planet with natural resources as if it were a balance sheet, just sort of
Yes.
meticulous accounting. And I realized this is an economic story,
Yes.
right? And it, you know, cost, benefit, black, white in some cases. But this sort of cut and dry economics view on this has not taken hold in most places.
Yes.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think one thing that I want even economics to do better is to give the vision of where we're supposed to head. When I was a student, I won't even tell you how many decades ago, and the first Nobel Prize in economic science was given in 1969, I think it is. And the winner, one of the winners was an economist named Tinbergen. And Tinbergen was a wonderful economist, very brilliant, also very practical. And he had a system called targets and instruments, and we call them goals now. goals and policies, but targets and instruments. Where do you want to go, and how can you get there? What dials do you turn? What levers do you pull? What investments do you make? And the whole idea was to think very concretely, I want to be here, I'm here, how do I get there? Well, we take out our Google Maps every moment, and we get the right path or Waze or whatever it is, and we find the path. We should be doing the same thing with the energy system. And cut and dried economics hasn't exactly done that properly. The problem with cut and dried economics of some of my colleagues, who I like, and they have a point, they say, put a price on carbon, let the market solve it. The truth is, this problem is not solvable that way alone. It's true, the market signals are wrong, so a price on carbon is a good thing. But what about land use? What about public choices, nuclear and not nuclear? How about running the grid as a system? How about the international diplomacy? Do you want a regional market or a national market? Those are not things the market can solve. An entrepreneur that has an idea, I want to bring hydropower from Canada to the US, suddenly realizes this is a complicated political problem. I need two national governments agreeing. I need the state of Maine, the state of Vermont, the state of Massachusetts, New York State. I worked on that problem a bit. And you cannot do that. Well, I worked with Hydro-Quebec, for example. A company cannot do this on its own. This is politics. This is policy. And so we need to understand really the path that we're going to take to get where we want to go. And economics points out why you want to do that, maybe some tools that you want to use like carbon pricing, but it doesn't give you the whole path. And we need something that's more holistic. So I've always liked having the climatologists, the engineers, the economists, and the policy types and the politicians together to design the package.
I wanted to kind of back way up to the 70s and ask about poverty, which was, of course, what kicked it all off before the climate discussion. We don't talk about poverty so much in the forefront anymore. Have we lost sight of the goals tied to eradicating poverty?
Well, Sustainable Development Goal number 1 is to end poverty. We have 17 Sustainable Development Goals. When they were set in 2015, a large part of the UN membership said, number 1, end poverty. Because they have poverty in their country. They know that that's the most urgent. When the Millennium Development Goals, which was the preceding set of goals, was promulgated in the year 2000, MDG number 1 was actually technically cut poverty by half the rate of extreme poverty by the year 2015. So most of the world, and certainly the low-income and lower-middle-income countries that still have extreme poverty, know that this is a big priority. Unfortunately, some of the voices we hear, I don't think Mr. Trump mentioned it yesterday at the United Nations, the U.S. Government is weird as it is kind of an open war against the Sustainable Development Goals. It's the strangest thing in the world. The goals are easy to ignore if you want to ignore them. I don't recommend it, but they're easy to ignore. But to go to war against sustainable development, not, in my mind, a great idea. But that's actually where the U.S. is. In terms of the actual situation on poverty, depending on what number you use, you might say 1 billion out of the 8 billion people are still in a pretty extreme situation. It's arguable, it could be more. I don't want to argue with anyone that says it's more, because by some metrics it is. Some say it's actually a little bit less according to income poverty. But the fact of the matter is, maybe as low as 6 or 7% of the world population and as high as 20% of the world population, depending on what kind of metric one is using, It's too much, too much. And then there's relative poverty. The U.S. has a lot of poverty that wouldn't be deemed to be extreme from the point of view of the poorest places in the world, but it's a lot of suffering in the U.S., and it means shorter lives and of course, more hardship. And so this issue deserves a lot more attention, but so many issues do, by the way. War and terrible waste of time on a lot of things take our attention away from what we really should be solving.
That's a great question, actually. I'd love to ask you, what should we be looking at right now as the priority? I ask for myself as much as anyone. Yeah. Are there areas that we should be focusing on that are being neglected?
Well, generally speaking, it is true. The most important challenges in the world are to end the wars that are raging right now, not only because they're horrific and tragic and terrible, but because they can get out of control. So this is the number one thing that should be done. Let's assume we do that today. We're at the UN, we have an outbreak of peace, and we turn to sustainable development and the climate question. Then we have a job cut out for us, which is a deep transformation of both the energy system and agriculture and land use to really make the planet safe and resilient and prosperous. And this is, as I've been saying, basically a quarter century work ahead. It's an investment program. It's a strategy that needs to be implemented. It can't happen all at once because we have an infrastructure that is largely still a fossil fuel infrastructure. It will depreciate. It will get replaced by the new. And with the new, contrary to what Mr. Trump says, the new should be clean and green. This is very important for the United States, by the way, because the rest of the world's going to do that. And if the U.S. just remains dirty, this is going to be to a terrible long-term economic disadvantage for the United States. So, assuming that the urgent issues of war and peace are put aside, make plans, two directions. One, the energy transformation, and second, the land use transformation. Land use gives you both carbon storage, but resilience of the farm systems. It preserves biodiversity. It gives so much protection on watersheds and against flooding and against many other things. So we need those two basic pillars. And what I advise morning till night, round the year to governments is make a plan. And when they say, not sure I know how to make a plan for this and this, I say, aha, you see, you haven't gotten to where you need to get to understand what to do.
It's very interesting. Thank you so much. That's all we have time for today.
Great to be with you.
But it was very interesting, and thank you. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
Thanks for joining us.